Right now, in Texas and across the country, a small group of billionaires is working to erase the line between religion and government, and most of us have no idea it's happening. The First Amendment's Establishment Clause states that government cannot establish, endorse, favor, or fund a religion. While this restricted the federal government from establishing an official national religion, like the Church of England, it did not apply to states. Some states, like Massachusetts and Connecticut, had state-sponsored churches and used tax dollars to support them. The Danbury Baptists, a religious minority in Connecticut, which still had an established Congregationalist church, wrote to Jefferson hoping he'd affirm religious liberty as a natural right, not a government-granted favor. In his reply, Jefferson coined the phrase, "a wall of separation between church and state," meaning government shouldn't promote or restrict religious belief. This was his own interpretation of the Establishment Clause, which implied a far more categorical separation between religion and government. Jefferson's interpretation later gained legal weight when the Supreme Court first cited it in 1878, and again in 1947, where it anchored the modern doctrine of strict church-state separation. Although Jefferson interpreted the Establishment Clause over 200 years ago, the fight over the separation of church and state is still being waged today. In education, this includes school prayer, Bible-infused curriculum, and Texas's new law requiring Ten Commandments displays in public school classrooms, currently being challenged in court and headed toward a likely Supreme Court showdown. Outside of education, the same tension surfaces in debates over abortion, same-sex marriage, LGBTQIA+ rights, contraception and reproductive health care, and end-of-life issues. While our U.S. Senators Ted Cruz and John Cornyn vote on federal laws and confirm the federal judges who interpret the Constitution, most of the everyday battles involving separation of church and state happen closer to home. Many of these laws have been written by our state legislature and then signed off by Governor Greg Abbott. Among them are Senate Bill 10, the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms, Senate Bill 11, prayer in classrooms, Senate Bill 8, the Texas Heartbeat Act, House Bill 1280, the Human Life Protection Act, and Senate Bill 14, the ban on gender-affirming care for minors. In public education, there are two main entities that make decisions outside of the Texas legislature. The 15-member elected SBOE sets statewide standards, teaks curriculum, approves instructional materials like Bluebonnet Learning, sets graduation requirements, and manages school funding. Local boards hold Texas's residual authority, Education Code Section 11.151. Everything else, local curriculum choices, budgets, tax rates, superintendent hiring, discipline codes, and library policy, accountable to their own community. That local, low-profile authority is exactly what makes school boards such an attractive target. Decisions that shape millions of kids' educations, made by relatively few people in low-turnout elections most voters never think about. The architects of Christian nationalism have spent decades learning to work that local system, from installing Christian evangelical activist David Barton as a Texas State Board of Education advisor, to building grassroots networks like Moms for Liberty to take over school boards, to PACs like Patriot Mobile Action, which spent almost $600,000 backing several conservative Christian school board candidates in North Texas. But Christian nationalism gets thrown around a lot without much explanation of what it actually means, or who's paying for it. Christian nationalism is the belief that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that its laws and institutions should say so, explicitly, and for one religion only. Watchdog groups and journalists have named Texas oil billionaire Tim Dunn as one of the movement's biggest financial engines. He is known for funding groups that list Christian nationalism among their stated priorities. And here's what some of that money has bought. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, a longtime Dunn ally, has used his office to sue school districts that don't display the Ten Commandments in every classroom, under a law the legislature passed in 2025. In addition, Governor Greg Abbott has signed several of the bills Dunn's network has pushed, from classroom curriculum changes to school voucher expansion. ProPublica reports that Dunn-aligned groups tell lawmakers directly how they're expected to vote and fund primary challengers against any Republican who doesn't fall in line. ProPublica calls it the most powerful political machine in Texas. Governor Abbott and Attorney General Paxton both actively campaigned against and endorsed primary challengers to House Republicans who either opposed his school voucher push or voted for Paxton's impeachment. In 2024, 15 Texas Republican House incumbents lost their seats to more conservative challengers, backed by Abbott, Paxton, and allied donor networks like Dunn's.
Sometimes, who is in charge in Texas politics?
Well, there are primarily two billionaires from West Texas, Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilks, that are the two most powerful men in Texas politics.
Beyond the classroom, Dunn's network has backed Texas's abortion ban, restrictions on the morning after pill, a ban on gender-affirming care for minors, and bills restricting trans Texans' bathroom access. Texas's abortion laws, among the strictest in the country, were written and defended largely on explicitly religious grounds, making one narrow theological view of when life begins, a conservative Christian one, the law for everyone, regardless of their own faith.
Thank you for joining with us here today. Our Creator endowed us with the right to life, and yet millions of children lose their right to life every year because of abortion.
Tim Dunn has also backed efforts to trigger an Article 5 constitutional convention, a path to rewrite the U.S. Constitution itself, rather than working only through ordinary legislation.
I knew we had to have a spiritual revival, a great awakening, and a political restoration for our country to come back to its roots. I knew that. What I did not expect is that Convention of States would be an organization that would trigger the Great Awakening, and that's what's happened. And it's a miracle. And that is why we're doing the Lord's work.
Although these Texas billionaires have a lot of monetary power, they can't take your voting power. The decisions about church and state are made by people like your local school board members and positions at the State Board of Education, all the way up to judges, the Attorney General, and the Governor. Do not let these billionaires speak for you. This isn't about being for or against faith. It's about keeping government out of the business of deciding whose faith counts. Organizations like the Texas Freedom Network have been tracking Christian nationalism for 30 years. TFN has fought efforts to censor textbooks, opposed private school vouchers, and other schemes to dismantle public education, and defended religious freedom from constant attack. Over the years, their work has expanded to include the battle for LGBTQIA plus equality, reproductive freedom, and more. Let's hear from President and Executive Director Felicia Martin about Texas Freedom Network's desire to have a state that serves all.
Well, I'm Felicia. I'm the president of the Texas Freedom Network by day, but I'm also a Latina. I'm a Rice graduate, queer, but I am a native Houstonian, third generation Texan. So Texas is my home. TFN is an organization that has been around for a while. We envision a Texas where communities come together to organize, lead, govern in pursuit of freedom to ensure that people have equitable access to public education and a Texas that serves all of us. 30 years we've been doing the work. We were founded by Cecile Richards, the daughter of the late, great Ann Richards, the last Democratic governor of Texas. She saw at that time in 1995 what the far right was doing, in particular at the State Board of Education. We have sort of branched out to think about civil liberties and social justice across the board, but we know that the right continues to do their work with these attacks on abortion, sex education, the demonization of LGBTQ people.
Can you give me a little bit of a summary of the historical context about how these religious extremists have been working to influence policy?
When Cecile sat at the SBOE in 1995, she saw what was happening firsthand in a very sort of predictable place, which is the State Board of Education. And she had really no idea that there were these debates happening around the textbooks that would be printed for Texas that would then have this impact beyond Texas because this is the major marketplace. They're coming at us at the school boards, library boards, and through the State Board of Education by actually having people seated there, having people elected to sit in these decision-making rooms to further their agenda of, extreme right politic.
So what does the Constitution say about religion?
I think that we can all agree, if we just look at the language, that the First Amendment of the Constitution states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So those two clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, work together. One prevents the government from promoting religion, and the other protects an individual's right to practice religion. So the question is not whether students can be religious. That has been sort of sustained throughout time. The question is whether the government should use its power to promote one religious tradition over others.
Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with required readings and
Mhm.
the Bible stories that are now being infused into the curriculum?
I think it's interesting because you really just see the headlines, when you're your everyday citizen looking at what's happening in the news. And so, what are they doing? We're requiring Bible now readings. Well, it's been very thoughtful. They've been very strategic in this. So, in June, this June, the board voted to approve controversial new social studies, entire social studies curriculum. That's K through 8. They postponed the vote for high school, but those would be things like U.S. history, world history, and world geography. So those are still they're going to be voted on in September. But those TEKs is what they call them, as passed in June, uh, put ideological agendas ahead of facts in education. So that's across the board. Rather than simply teach the truth about our history and society, the SBOE appears determined to distort the past to align with their members' ideological political views. And if you just spend 10 minutes listening to an SBOE meeting, you'll see the personalities sort of erupt of those board members really espousing some of those very far right extremist beliefs. Also, under the TEA direction, the SBOE was tasked with building a required reading list, is what you referred to. So there was a reading list, and there's the curriculum, which is much bigger.
Mhm.
But the reading list is required. This is not optional, right? A required reading list of roughly 200 texts for Texas students. So state officials, not parents or teachers or faith leaders, chose to include more than a dozen biblical narratives on this list that's required. The teachers cannot deviate from, right? Students have to read these things. Not one selection reflects a faith tradition other than Christianity. Not one. Even though public schools serve children of every faith and no faith, right? And in Jude, the board approved this list, which now includes biblical passages and verses at nearly every grade level. So there's definitely some research out there that shows those examples at every grade level of what passages are being referenced.
There's references to the Bible all the time in our culture.
Mhm.
So what's wrong with, shouldn't kids know where that comes from? So how would you answer that?
Yeah, I think the issue isn't, that the Bible doesn't have cultural or literary significance. I think it's how it's being used is what we have issue with. And, religion has profoundly shaped our history. Students should know about that. They should learn about that. I think the problem is when we see public schools stop teaching about religion and start endorsing one version of it. We don't say freedom from religion at TFN. We say freedom of religion, to
Sure.
believe or not to believe, because we know those are important tenets for people. But we do believe that they should be protected from the government promotion of one over another, which has never seemed to be anything that the Constitution wanted for our country. And so when schools remain neutral, every student has that freedom to learn without feeling pressured to believe.
I wanted to ask you about what Christian nationalism is.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. I think, let me tell you what it's not, because I want to make sure that people understand this who may be new to all of this language, is that Christian nationalism is not Christianity, right? Those are two different philosophies and ideas about the practice of faith. Christian nationalism also sounds like a religious movement, but it's not. It's a political ideology that fuses Christianity with American identity. And it demands our government. It demands that our government and the laws and the civic society be dominated in this very narrow, conservative interpretation of the Bible, right? That those that practice Christianity know that that's not the Christianity that they necessarily subscribe to, but Christian nationalism wants to take that symbol of Christianity and assume, rights over it. So I think that when we think about how this is starting to take shape in Texas, we like to be the model for the
Yeah.
country how to do this. It's, thinking about how many Christians they can put in office, to hold office, to be in decision-making spaces. They want to restrict non-Christian expression in public spaces. So that's intentional as well. They're opposed to public education that is not in sync with these ideas of having Christianity centered in history and language in the physical space of school buildings, right? They reject women's equality. They call for a repealing of the 19th Amendment that guaranteed women the right to vote. Many people may not know that. And they want to criminalize same-sex relationships.
Do you think that some of those school board members who have been pushing for this are also part of that movement? I mean,
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. We have to be careful about labeling anyone in that way. But I do think that if you look again behind the curtains, you will find many of those people who are sitting in those seats have been aided by massive funding from those same billionaires.
So how can people fight against this extremism? Like you talked about testifying.
Yeah.
What are some other ways that just your average person can fight against this kind of extremism?
What you're doing, right? What you're doing, talking about it, being curious about it, showing up. Like, even if you don't know what to do, you show up at a school board meeting because you kind of want to know what's going on, whether you have kids in the system or not. I think that those are things that you really should be interested in. And to think that Cecile, who was very in touch with politics, her mother was the governor, wasn't aware of what was happening at the State Board of Education until a friend brought her in and said, "You got to see what's going on." That's your white woman of privilege.
Right.
Right. Imagine your everyday citizen just not understanding what's happening and the power of their voice, what they can do if they are able to mobilize, organize, learn, and speak out. And you're seeing more people start to show up at school board meetings, speak at the school board meetings, speak at the SBOE. We had 7-year-old, 8-year-olds speaking at the SBO, 7 to 99, understanding that we all get our 2 minutes, right? We all have 2 minutes to go and say what we need to do. We can write cards, we can be loud. And sometimes in Texas, that's the only thing that we can do right now, right? Like, we don't have the voting mechanisms yet. That requires building power over time, which many of us, that's our business. That's what we're trying to do.
Right.
But it's going to take time, investment, and money. And in the meantime, your everyday citizen needs to show up, right? Learn, watch a video, get curious, ask questions, interview people, join coalitions of people who you are like-minded, right? I think I go to senior homes for democracy groups all the time, and they're hungry for information, right? They want to know what's happening. And Cecile always said this, if there's a room of 2 people, you organize, right? 2 or more
Right.
people are enough people for you to organize. And so I will go and show up wherever I can to, share information. I don't need to sit in a position to tell you how to vote or who to vote for. I think that, as an educated citizen, if you have enough information, you can make informed decisions, but at least know what you're voting for. And if you decide
Right.
not to show up to vote, know that you're saying something by doing that too, right? So
Right.
that we don't get an out as Americans. We should always remember that our ability to vote and our right to vote was held back from us for so long that if we choose not to use it, then we should get what we get. If we
Yeah,
choose not to use our
absolutely.
voice, we get what we get. And so there's a lot of ways to be involved.